What noble women really did when their husbands left for war. Marguerite heard the horses leaving before dawn, their hooves loud on the cobblestones of the courtyard below her window. She didn't get out of bed. She stayed perfectly still under the heavy blankets, her eyes closed, listening to her husband's voice calling out final instructions to his men. The jingle of armor and weapons, the creak of leather saddles, the sounds of an army preparing to march. Her husband Robert was leaving for the King's War in Flanders, taking with him 40 men from their estate and leaving Marguerite alone to manage everything he left behind. The horses moved out through the gate. The sounds faded into the distance. Then there was silence. Marguerite opened her eyes and smiled. She was free. Robert would be gone for months, maybe a year, possibly longer. Men left for campaigns and sometimes never returned, killed in battle or by disease or simply disappearing into the chaos of war. But even if Robert survived, even if he came home victorious and wealthy with plunder, Marguerite had months ahead of her. Months when she would be the absolute authority over the chateau and the lands and the hundreds of people who lived and worked here. Months when no one would tell her what to do, how to behave, who she could see or speak to. Months when she could do whatever she wanted. She rose from bed as the sun came up, calling for her maid Jeanne to help her dress. Not in the heavy formal gowns Robert preferred, the ones that showed her status as a nobleman's wife. Instead, she chose something simpler, more comfortable, a dress she could actually move in. Jeanne raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Jeanne had been with Marguerite since childhood and understood things that didn't need to be spoken aloud. This was France in 1297. Wars were constant. Kings needed armies and nobles provided them, leaving their wives behind to manage estates that could span thousands of acres and support hundreds of people. These women suddenly found themselves with more power than they'd ever had in their marriages, more freedom than society normally allowed them. What they did with that power and freedom was something few people talked about openly, but everyone knew happened. The stories were whispered in markets and taverns, passed along by servants who saw things they weren't supposed to see, embellished and retold until they became legend. But the truth was often more interesting than the legends. Marguerite was 26 years old. She had been married to Robert for 9 years since she was 17 and he was 32. It was a good marriage by the standards of their class, arranged between their families to unite estates and strengthen alliances. Robert was not cruel. He didn't beat her. He provided well. He treated her with a distant kind of respect, the way a man might treat a valuable horse or a well-crafted sword. She was his property, but expensive property, worth taking care of. She had given him 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, which was her primary duty. The children were being raised by nurses and tutors, as was proper for noble families. Marguerite saw them occasionally, supervised their education, made sure they were healthy and learning what they needed to learn. But she was not expected to spend her days caring for them. That was servants' work. What she was expected to do was manage the household, entertain guests, attend mass daily, embroider, read devotional texts, and generally behave as a proper noblewoman should. Quietly, obediently, without drawing attention or causing scandal. Robert had been very clear about that before he left. Marguerite was to maintain the household's reputation. No parties, no entertainment, no visitors except family and trusted neighbours. She was to be beyond reproach, a model of feminine virtue, so that when he returned his honour would be intact. Marguerite had nodded and agreed to everything. She had kissed him farewell. She had waved from the window as he rode away. Now she stood in her chamber and began planning exactly how she would spend her freedom. The chateau had already changed in the few hours since Robert left. She could feel it. The servants moved differently, less rigid, less afraid. The men-at-arms Robert had left behind to guard the estate were relaxed, knowing their real commander was gone. Even the air seemed lighter somehow, as if the building itself was breathing easier without Robert's heavy presence filling every room. Marguerite descended to the great hall where breakfast was waiting. Just bread and cheese and wine, simple food because there was no one to impress. She ate slowly, thinking through her situation. She had power now, real power, more than she'd ever had while Robert was here. She controlled the household funds. She made all decisions about the estate. She could hire and dismiss servants. She could go where she wanted, see who she wanted, do what she wanted, as long as she was careful enough that no scandal reached back to Robert's ears. And Marguerite was very good at being careful. After breakfast, she called for her steward, an older man named Guillaume, who had served the family for decades. She gave him instructions about the day's work, listened to his reports about the fields and the livestock, and the rents owed by the tenant farmers. She played the role perfectly, the responsible lady managing her husband's affairs in his absence. Guillaume seemed satisfied. He bowed and left to carry out her orders. Then Marguerite called for Jeanne. "Send a message to Chateau Montfort," she said quietly. "Tell them I will visit this afternoon to call on Lady Catherine." Jeanne's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. Lady Catherine was a widow, respectable enough that a visit would raise no questions. But Lady Catherine also had a brother, Philippe, who was young and handsome, and according to rumours, Marguerite had heard at court last year, very charming with women. "Of course, my lady," Jeanne said. "Shall I prepare your travelling clothes?" "Yes, and tell the stable to ready my horse. I'll ride, not take the carriage." Riding was faster. Riding was more private. In a carriage, she would need guards and attendants. On horseback, she could take just Jeanne and maybe one guard, people who knew when to look away and keep their mouths shut. Marguerite spent the rest of the morning attending to household duties, maintaining the appearance of the dutiful wife. She checked the kitchens and the storerooms. She reviewed accounts with the cook. She visited the chapel and prayed because the chaplain would report to Robert if she neglected her religious obligations. Everything proper. Everything correct. But inside, her heart was racing. It had been so long since she'd felt this way, since she'd felt anything except the dull routine of her constrained life. Robert's attention in bed was perfunctory and infrequent, something done out of duty to produce heirs, not pleasure. He was not interested in her desires, had never asked what she wanted, probably didn't even realize she had wants beyond food and shelter and expensive dresses. But Marguerite had desires. She had thoughts and fantasies she'd never spoken aloud, things that would horrify the chaplain if he knew. She had spent 9 years locked in the cage of respectability, playing the role she'd been assigned. Now, finally, the cage door was open. She just had to be smart about it. By midday, she was dressed for riding, mounted on her favourite mare with Jeanne beside her and a single guard following at a discreet distance. The road to Chateau Montfort wound through forest and fields, about an hour's ride. It was a clear autumn day, cool but not cold, the leaves just beginning to turn colour. Marguerite felt the wind in her face and the movement of the horse beneath her, and realised she was happy, genuinely happy, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The guard was Bernard, a man in his 40s who had served Robert for years, but who had also, Marguerite had noticed, a talent for not seeing things that might complicate his life. When she had affairs to conduct, Bernard would be the perfect choice to accompany her. Not because he approved, but because he understood that his comfortable position depended on discretion. They rode in silence mostly, just the sound of hooves on the packed dirt road and birds in the trees around them. Marguerite let her mind wander, thinking about Philippe. She had met him only once, briefly, at a gathering at court. He was perhaps 23 or 24, younger than her by a few years, the second son of a minor noble family. Second sons had few prospects unless they joined the church or made their fortune in war. Philippe had done neither. Instead, he lived with his widowed sister Catherine, helping her manage her late husband's estate, charming visitors, and, according to the whispers Marguerite had heard, enjoying the company of bored noblewomen whose husbands were away. The thought made her pulse quicken. She knew what she was doing was dangerous. If word got back to Robert, if anyone realised what she intended, the consequences could be severe. A woman's reputation was everything. A noblewoman caught in adultery could be divorced, sent to a convent, stripped of her children and property. Her family would be disgraced. Her children's prospects would be damaged. But the risk was part of what made it exciting. The knowledge that she was doing something forbidden, something that could destroy her if she wasn't careful, made every moment feel more vivid, more alive. She had been so careful for so long, so obedient, so proper. Just this once, she wanted to feel something real. Chateau Montfort appeared through the trees ahead, a smaller estate than Marguerite's, but well maintained, its walls solid stone and its gates open to visitors. A servant came out to take their horses as they dismounted. Marguerite gave her name and said she was calling on Lady Catherine. The servant bowed and led them inside. The hall was comfortable and well furnished, though not as grand as Marguerite's own home. Lady Catherine appeared quickly, a woman in her early 30s with a kind face and intelligent eyes. She greeted Marguerite warmly, kissing her cheeks and welcoming her to her home. There was no surprise in Catherine's manner, which made Marguerite wonder if the message Jeanne had sent had included some hint of her real purpose. They sat in the solar, a bright room with windows overlooking the gardens. A servant brought wine and small cakes. Catherine asked about Robert's departure, about the children, about the management of the estate, all perfectly normal conversation between noblewomen. But there was something in Catherine's eyes, a hint of amusement or understanding, that suggested she knew this visit was not entirely innocent. After perhaps half an hour of polite talk, Catherine mentioned that her brother Philippe was visiting. Would Marguerite like to meet him? Of course, Marguerite said, maintaining her composed expression while her heart beat faster. Philippe entered the solar a few minutes later, and Marguerite understood immediately why women found him attractive. He was tall and lean with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. His smile was easy and confident. He bowed to Marguerite with exactly the right degree of respect. Not too formal, not too familiar. His voice when he spoke was warm and pleasant, the kind of voice that made you want to keep listening. Catherine made introductions and then, with admirable subtlety, mentioned that she needed to check on something in the kitchen. She left Marguerite and Philippe alone in the solar, with only Jeanne present, and Jeanne had the good sense to move to the far end of the room and pretend to be absorbed in examining a tapestry. Philippe sat across from Marguerite and poured more wine for both of them. His movements were graceful, unhurried. He asked how she was finding the management of her estate in her husband's absence. A perfectly innocent question, but the way he asked it, with a slight emphasis on the word absence, suggested he understood exactly why she was here. Marguerite met his eyes directly. "It's challenging," she said, "but also liberating in some ways. There are freedoms I didn't have before." Philippe smiled. "I imagine there are many things a woman in your position might want to explore," he said. "Opportunities that don't present themselves when one's husband is present." The conversation continued in this vein, both of them speaking in careful euphemisms that could be interpreted as innocent if anyone was listening, but which both understood had a different meaning entirely. Philippe was very good at this, Marguerite realized. He had done this before, many times, probably. He knew how to flirt without being obvious, how to make his interest clear without saying anything that could be used against him. After perhaps an hour, Philippe suggested they walk in the gardens. The weather was fine, he said, and Catherine's roses were still blooming. Would Marguerite care to see them? Marguerite agreed. They left the solar and descended to the gardens, Jeanne following at a distance that was respectful, but also Marguerite noted far enough that she wouldn't hear their conversation. The gardens were beautiful, well tended with narrow paths between beds of flowers and herbs. Philippe walked beside Marguerite, close enough that their arms almost touched. He pointed out various plants, told her their names and uses, but Marguerite barely heard him. She was intensely aware of his presence beside her, of the warmth of his body, of the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. They reached a small arbour covered in climbing roses, secluded from view of the chateau by hedges. Philippe stopped and turned to face her. The playful, careful tone was gone from his voice when he spoke. "You didn't come here to see Catherine," he said. "You came to see me." Marguerite could have denied it, could have pretended to be offended, could have maintained the fiction that this was just an innocent social call. Instead, she met his eyes and said, "Yes, I came to see you." Philippe stepped closer. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Marguerite felt her pulse racing. She had never done anything like this before, had never been this bold. But she was tired of being careful, tired of denying herself, tired of living in the narrow confines of what was proper and acceptable. "I want," she said, "to feel something besides duty and obligation. I want to remember what it's like to be desired, not as a wife or a mother or a piece of property, but as myself." Philippe reached out and touched her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek. "Then we understand each other," he said. He kissed her, and Marguerite felt something inside her that had been locked away for years suddenly break free. She kissed him back, her hands on his shoulders pulling him closer. For a moment, nothing else existed except this. The heat of his mouth on hers, the feel of his body pressed against her, the sudden, overwhelming rush of desire that she had forgotten she was capable of feeling. They broke apart, both breathing hard. Philippe looked at her with eyes that were dark with want. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Catherine will be visiting a neighbour. The chateau will be quiet. We can have time together, real time, without pretending." Marguerite knew she should say no, knew this was already dangerous enough, but she found herself nodding, agreeing, already thinking about how she would arrange to return. She left Chateau Montfort an hour later, after more polite conversation with Catherine, after appropriate farewells and promises to visit again soon. She rode home with Jeanne and Bernard, her expression composed, giving nothing away. But inside she was trembling with excitement and fear and anticipation. That night she lay in bed alone in the chambers she had shared with Robert and thought about what she was doing. She knew the risks. She knew that discovery would mean ruin. But she also knew that she had spent 9 years being the perfect wife, the perfect lady, following every rule and meeting every expectation. And it had brought her nothing except emptiness and boredom, and a growing sense that her life was slipping away without her ever really living it. Tomorrow, she would go back. Tomorrow, she would cross a line she could never uncross. And she found that the prospect didn't frighten her as much as it excited her. The next morning, Marguerite woke early and went through her usual routine. She attended Mass in the chapel. She met with Guillaume about estate business. She checked on the children. Everything normal, everything proper. Then she told Jeanne to prepare the horses. She was going to visit Lady Catherine again. A courtesy call, perfectly innocent. Jeanne said nothing, just nodded, and went to make the arrangements. Bernard saddled the horses without comment. They rode out through the gates and down the forest road towards Chateau Montfort, the autumn sun bright overhead. Catherine met her at the gates this time, and Marguerite could see the understanding in her eyes. "My brother is in the East Tower," Catherine said quietly. "The servants have instructions not to disturb him. There's a private stair that leads up from the garden. Jeanne will show you." So Catherine knew, was perhaps even facilitating this. Marguerite wondered how many other women Catherine had helped in this way. How many affairs had been conducted in her chateau with her quiet approval. But she didn't ask. Some things were better left unspoken. Jeanne led her through the gardens to a narrow stone staircase that wound up the outside of the tower. Marguerite climbed it alone, her heart pounding, her hands shaking slightly. At the top was a wooden door. She knocked softly. Philippe opened it immediately. He had been waiting for her. He pulled her inside and kissed her before she could speak, and Marguerite let herself sink into the sensation, let herself stop thinking and analysing and just feel. The room was simple but comfortable, with a large bed and windows that let in the afternoon light. Philippe led her to the bed, and they sat together, still kissing, his hands beginning to explore her body through the layers of her dress. Marguerite had forgotten what this felt like. To be touched with desire instead of duty, to have someone's full attention focused on her pleasure instead of just their own. They undressed each other slowly, Philippe's hands patient and skilled, knowing exactly how to unlace and untie the complicated garments noblewomen wore. When they were finally naked together, Marguerite felt a moment of self-consciousness. She had borne 3 children. Her body was not what it had been at 17, but Philippe looked at her like she was beautiful, like he wanted her, and that was enough to quiet her doubts. What happened next was everything Marguerite had been missing in her marriage. Philippe paid attention to her, responded to her, seemed genuinely interested in her pleasure. It was so different from the quick, perfunctory encounters with Robert that it almost felt like a different act entirely. Afterward, they lay together in the tangled sheets, Philippe's arm around her, and Marguerite felt more relaxed than she had in years. They talked quietly about nothing important, just the easy conversation of 2 people who had shared intimacy. Philippe told her about his life, about being a second son with no real prospects, about the strange position he occupied in his sister's household. Marguerite told him about the constraints of her marriage, about the expectations that weighed on her constantly. About the sense that she was living someone else's life instead of her own. Eventually, the afternoon shadows grew long, and Marguerite knew she needed to return home. She dressed with Philippe's help, both of them slower now, reluctant to end this. Before she left, he asked if she would come again. Marguerite said yes without hesitation. This became the pattern of her days. She would manage the estate in the mornings, attend to her duties, maintain every appearance of being the responsible lady of the manor. Then in the afternoons she would ride to Chateau Montfort, climb the stairs to Philippe's room, and for a few hours forget everything except the pleasure of being with someone who wanted her. Catherine never said anything directly, but she made it easy. The servants were always elsewhere. The chateau was always quiet. Jeanne and Bernard were always discreet. Marguerite paid Jeanne extra from the household funds, and Jeanne accepted without comment, understanding that her mistress's secrets were now her own as well. Weeks passed. Marguerite grew bolder. Sometimes she stayed at Chateau Montfort through dinner, enjoying Catherine's company and Philippe's wit, playing at being just friends when the servants were present, then stealing away for an hour alone before she had to ride home in the darkness. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The affair wasn't just about the physical pleasure, though that was certainly part of it. It was about being seen as a person, not a role. It was about making her own choices, even if those choices were dangerous. It was about reclaiming some part of herself that marriage and duty and society's expectations had tried to erase. But she was also careful. She never let her guard down completely. She never forgot that discovery would mean disaster. She varied her visits so they didn't fall into a predictable pattern. She made sure other people saw her attending to estate business, going to mass, visiting other neighbours. She built a careful network of plausible activities that would explain her movements if anyone asked. And she watched the roads constantly for any sign of Robert's return. 2 months after Robert left, Marguerite received a letter. The campaign was going well. He expected to be home by spring, perhaps earlier if the fighting ended quickly. He trusted she was managing the estate properly. He expected to find everything in order when he returned. Marguerite read the letter twice and then burned it in the fireplace. Spring. She had months still, but not forever. Eventually this would have to end. Eventually Robert would come home and she would have to go back to being his wife, his property, the respectable lady who never stepped out of line. She decided not to think about that yet. She had time. She would use every moment of it. That afternoon she rode to Chateau Montfort as usual. Philippe knew immediately that something was wrong. He asked what had happened. Marguerite showed him Robert's letter, which she had saved from the fire. Philippe read it silently, then handed it back. "How long?" he asked. "Until spring," Marguerite said. "Maybe sooner." Philippe pulled her close. "Then we make the most of the time we have," he said. They became less careful after that. Not reckless, but less constrained. Marguerite stayed later at Chateau Montfort. Sometimes she brought wine and food, and they would have small feasts in Philippe's room, laughing and talking for hours before falling into bed together. Catherine sometimes joined them for dinner, creating a strange but comfortable domestic scene. The widow and her brother and the married woman conducting an affair under everyone's noses. Marguerite wondered sometimes if Catherine was lonely, if she was living vicariously through Marguerite's affair. Catherine had been married young to a much older man who died after only a few years, leaving her wealthy but alone. She seemed content with her life, managing her estate, entertaining visitors, looking after her brother. But there was a wistfulness in her eyes sometimes when she watched Marguerite and Philippe together. One evening, after too much wine, Catherine told Marguerite about her own marriage. Her husband had been kind but cold, interested in her only as a vessel for heirs. When he died before she produced any children, his family had tried to take the estate from her, claiming she had failed in her duty. She had fought them in court and won, but the experience had left her bitter. She had decided she would never marry again, never put herself under a man's control. She would live on her own terms, even if that meant being alone. Marguerite understood. They were both women trying to carve out some space for themselves in a world that didn't want to give them any. Catherine had chosen independence. Marguerite had chosen this affair, this temporary rebellion. Neither choice was perfect. Both carried costs, but they were choices, and that mattered. Winter came. The roads became muddy and then frozen. Marguerite's visits to Chateau Montfort became less frequent, both because of the weather and because she needed to be more visible at her own estate. Winter was when tenants needed help, when food stores had to be carefully managed, when the poor came to the chateau gates asking for charity. These were her responsibilities and she took them seriously, even as she counted the days until she could see Philippe again. She received another letter from Robert. The campaign had stalled. Winter made fighting difficult. He would stay with the army through the cold months and resume in spring. He might not be home until summer now. More time. Marguerite felt relief and guilt in equal measure. She wanted Philippe. But she also knew that the longer this went on, the more dangerous it became. Affairs that lasted months were harder to hide than brief flings. People noticed patterns, servants talked. Eventually, someone would realize what was happening, and then everything would fall apart. But she couldn't stop, didn't want to stop. So she continued, careful but persistent, stealing whatever moments she could. One cold January afternoon, Marguerite was in the chapel praying when the chaplain approached her. He was an older man, devout and serious, who had served the family for decades. He asked if he could speak with her privately. Marguerite felt a flash of fear, but kept her expression calm. "Of course," she said. They went to the chaplain's small chamber adjacent to the chapel. He asked her to sit. Then he told her that he had heard rumours. Nothing specific, just whispers among the servants. That Lady Marguerite was spending a great deal of time at Château Montfort. That perhaps her visits were not entirely appropriate given her husband's absence. Marguerite's heart was racing, but she forced herself to stay composed. She asked what he was implying. The chaplain said he was implying nothing, merely expressing concern for her reputation. Appearances mattered. A lady alone without her husband had to be especially careful. Any hint of impropriety could damage not just her own standing, but her entire family's. Marguerite thanked him for his concern and assured him that her visits to Château Montfort were entirely innocent. Lady Catherine was a friend and a valuable ally in managing a state business. Nothing more. The chaplain looked unconvinced, but he nodded and said he was glad to hear it. He would pray for her continued wisdom and virtue. After leaving the chapel, Marguerite went straight to her chambers and told Jeanne what had happened. Jeanne's face went pale. If the chaplain suspected something, others did too. They needed to be more careful. Maybe stop the visits entirely for a while. But Marguerite couldn't bear the thought of stopping. Not now. Not when she had so little time left before Robert returned. She decided on a compromise. She would be more visible at her own estate. She would invite other nobles to visit, host dinners, attend more church services. She would create a public life that was so busy and so proper that no one would have time to question her private one. And she would continue seeing Philippe, but less often. Once a week instead of 3 or 4 times, always with a good excuse, always with other stops along the way to create alibis. It worked, more or less. The whispers died down. The chaplain seemed satisfied. Marguerite's reputation remained intact, but the pleasure had gone out of the affair somewhat. What had been exciting and liberating now felt furtive and guilty. She and Philippe had less time together, and the time they had was shadowed by the knowledge that they were being watched. Spring came, the roads cleared, messengers travelled more freely. Marguerite received word that Robert's campaign had been successful. He had distinguished himself in battle. He was being rewarded with additional lands, and he would be home within the month. 1 month, 4 weeks, 30 days. Marguerite rode to Château Montfort one last time. She and Philippe spent the afternoon together, both of them knowing this was goodbye. They didn't talk about the future. There was no future for them. Philippe would continue his life here with Catherine. Marguerite would go back to being Robert's wife. What they had shared would become a memory, a secret they would carry separately. When it was time to leave, Philippe walked her down to where Jeanne waited with the horses. He kissed her hand formally, as any gentleman would when saying farewell to a lady, but his eyes held everything they couldn't say aloud. Marguerite mounted her horse and rode away without looking back, knowing that if she looked back she might not be able to leave. Robert returned 3 weeks later, exactly when he said he would. He rode through the gates at the head of his men, dusty and tired but healthy and victorious. Marguerite was waiting in the courtyard, dressed in her finest gown, every inch the noble lady welcoming her warrior husband home. She embraced him. She kissed him. She told him how much she had missed him. She played her role perfectly. That night in their chamber, Robert took her to bed with the same perfunctory efficiency as always. Nothing had changed for him. He had been away fighting, and now he was home, and his wife was here where she belonged. Marguerite lay beside him afterward and stared at the ceiling, thinking about Philippe, about the afternoons in the tower room, about the brief window of freedom that had now closed forever. The next morning she resumed her normal life as if nothing had happened. She managed the household. She supervised the children. She attended mass and embroidered and entertained guests. She smiled and laughed and played the contented wife. And no one except Jeanne and Bernard and Catherine and Philippe knew that anything had ever been different. Months passed, a year. Robert talked sometimes. Yeah, about the campaign, about the battles he had fought and the men he had killed. He never asked what Marguerite had done while he was gone. It wouldn't have occurred to him to ask. Her life was domestic and therefore unimportant, not worth discussing beyond whether she had managed the estate finances properly. Marguerite saw Catherine occasionally at social gatherings. They greeted each other politely, distantly, like acquaintances rather than friends. Philippe was sometimes present. He bowed to Marguerite with perfect correctness and called her Lady Marguerite and made pleasant conversation about weather and harvests. They never spoke about what had been between them. They never acknowledged it in any way. It was as if those months had never happened. But Marguerite remembered. On the nights when Robert was away on business or sleeping in another room after drinking too much at dinner, Marguerite would lie in bed and remember what it had felt like to be desired, to be seen, to be free. Even if only temporarily, she would remember Philippe's hands on her body, his voice in her ear, the way he looked at her like she mattered. She never took another lover. The risk was too great, and besides, what she had wanted wasn't really about Philippe specifically. It was about reclaiming something of herself, proving that she was more than the role she had been assigned. She had done that. The affair had changed her, not outwardly, but internally. She knew now what she was capable of. She knew that the dutiful wife and mother was a mask she wore, not her true self. And that knowledge, secret as it was, sustained her through the years that followed. Robert never found out. The chaplain never spoke of his suspicions again. The servants who might have known kept their mouths shut, either out of loyalty to Marguerite or because speaking up would have cost them their positions. The affair remained hidden, one of countless secrets that women of that era carried with them to their graves. This was what really happened when noblewomen's husbands left for war. Not all of them had affairs, certainly. Many were faithful, either from devotion or fear or simple lack of opportunity. But some, like Marguerite, seized the chance to live differently, even if only briefly. They took lovers. They made their own choices. They experienced pleasure and desire and autonomy. And then, when their husbands returned, they went back to their cages and pretended none of it had ever happened. The official histories didn't record these stories. They focused on battles and treaties and the actions of kings and great lords. The private lives of women were considered unimportant, not worthy of documentation. But the stories existed anyway, passed down through generations, whispered by servants and chronicled in private letters and journals that occasionally survived the centuries. Marguerite lived another 30 years after her affair with Philippe. She bore Robert 2 more children. She managed the estate when he was away on later campaigns. She became known as a wise and capable lady, someone other nobles came to for advice. She raised her children and saw them married off to appropriate spouses. She attended the weddings of her grandchildren. She grew old in the chateau where she had spent most of her life. Philippe married eventually, a respectable match to a merchant's daughter that brought money into his sister's estate. He had children of his own. He became a local magistrate, well regarded and prosperous. He and Marguerite crossed paths occasionally over the years at various social functions. They were always perfectly polite. They never spoke privately. Whatever had been between them remained buried under layers of respectability and time. Catherine never remarried. She ran her estate until her death, independent to the end. In her will, she left money to establish a small chapel where masses would be said for her soul and for the souls of all women who had suffered in unhappy marriages. It was a subtle rebellion, a quiet acknowledgement of the constraints that had shaped her life and the lives of so many others. When Marguerite was old, perhaps 60 or so, one of her granddaughters came to her with a question. The girl was about to be married, was nervous about what marriage would mean, what would be expected of her. She asked her grandmother if she had been happy in her marriage, if she had any regrets. Marguerite looked at this young woman, so full of hope and fear and uncertainty about her future, and thought about how to answer. She could tell the truth, that her marriage had been a cage, that she had spent decades playing a role that had little to do with who she really was. But what good would that do? The girl was going to marry regardless. That was her duty, her purpose. Knowing it might make her unhappy wouldn't change anything. So instead, Marguerite said that marriage was what you made of it, that there would be difficulties and disappointments, but also satisfactions, that the key was to find small moments of joy wherever you could, that you were stronger than you thought, that you would survive. The granddaughter seemed satisfied with this answer and went off to prepare for her wedding. Marguerite watched her go and thought about the affair with Philippe, about those stolen afternoons in the tower room, about the feeling of being alive and free and herself. She had paid a price for those moments in the guilt and secrecy and constant fear of discovery, but she had never regretted them. They were proof that she had existed as more than just a wife and mother. They were her rebellion, small and private as it was. She died a few years later, surrounded by family, given all the proper rites and buried in the family chapel. Her gravestone recorded her name, her husband's name, the dates of her birth and death, and the fact that she had been a devoted wife and mother. It said nothing about who she really was, about her desires and dreams, and the brief period when she had lived according to her own will. Those things died with her, as they did with so many women of her time. But the pattern continued. Other noblewomen whose husbands left for war or business found themselves suddenly in charge of estates and households. Some remained faithful. Others took lovers. Some had discreet affairs that remained hidden. Others were caught and suffered the consequences. The stories were all different in their details, but similar in their essence. Women finding ways to carve out space for themselves in a world that wanted to deny them autonomy. Women making choices, even dangerous ones, because the alternative was to never choose anything at all. These stories were rarely recorded in official documents, but they existed in oral traditions, in gossip and rumour, in the private letters and journals that occasionally survived. They existed in the memories of servants who witnessed things they weren't supposed to see. They existed in the knowledge passed down from mother to daughter about what was possible, what was dangerous, what could be gotten away with if you were careful enough. This is the hidden history of medieval women. Not passive victims waiting at home for their husbands to return. Not saints devoted entirely to duty and virtue, but complex human beings with desires and agency, making choices within extremely constrained circumstances, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing, but always trying to be more than what society wanted them to be. Marguerite's story was just one among thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, each one unique, each one similar, each one a small act of rebellion against the weight of expectation and restriction that defined women's lives in that era. Most of these stories are lost now. The women who lived them left no records, or their records were destroyed, or they were simply forgotten as unimportant. But some traces remain. In account books that show unexplained expenses that might have been payments to lovers or bribes to servants for their silence. In court records of women accused of adultery. In the margins of religious texts where scribes recorded gossip alongside their prayers. In letters between women discussing matters in coded language that becomes clear only when you know what to look for. The official history, the one taught in schools and written in textbooks, focuses on kings and wars and treaties and the public sphere where men operated. It treats women as footnotes, as wives and mothers whose individual lives didn't matter much beyond their role in producing heirs and managing households. But there was another history happening simultaneously, a private history of resistance and rebellion, and women finding ways to live on their own terms even when those terms were severely limited. Marguerite knew both histories. She lived in both. Publicly, she was the perfect noblewoman, the dutiful wife, the devoted mother. Privately, she was someone else entirely, a woman with desires and agency who took enormous risks to experience a brief period of freedom. Both versions were true, both versions were her, and the fact that only one version made it into the historical record doesn't mean the other version didn't exist or didn't matter. This is what really happened when noblewomen's husbands left for war. Behind the official story of faithful wives managing estates and praying for their husband's safe return was a more complicated reality. Some women did remain faithful. Some had affairs. Some fell in love with their lovers. Some simply wanted physical pleasure. Some sought emotional connection. Some craved autonomy and power. The motivations were as varied as the women themselves. And when their husbands returned, most of these women went back to their assigned roles. They put away their lovers and their independence and resumed being wives and mothers. They kept their secrets and carried on. Some surely regretted their affairs. Others treasured the memories. Most probably felt complicated mixtures of both. The affair between Marguerite and Philippe lasted only a few months, but it shaped the rest of Marguerite's life, not because it was some grand love affair, but because it proved to her that she was capable of making her own choices, of experiencing pleasure, of being someone other than what everyone expected. That knowledge sustained her through decades of marriage to a man who never really saw her as a person. It gave her a core of strength that no one could take away because no one except a few trusted confidants even knew it existed. This was the reality of medieval women's lives: complex, contradictory, constrained but not entirely powerless. They worked within systems that limited them severely, but they also found ways to push against those limitations, to carve out small spaces of autonomy and choice. Sometimes they got away with it, sometimes they didn't. But they tried, and that trying, that refusal to completely submit to the roles assigned to them, that determination to be fully human even when society wanted to reduce them to functions and duties, that was its own kind of resistance. The story of what happened when noble women's husbands left for war is not a simple story of virtue or vice. It's a story about human beings dealing with loneliness and desire and power and constraint. It's a story about women making choices in situations where they had very few choices available. It's a story that the official histories mostly ignored, but which was real and significant to the women who lived it. Marguerite's granddaughter, the one who asked about marriage, eventually had her own story. She married as planned. Her husband left occasionally for royal service. What she did during his absences was her own business. Perhaps she remained faithful. Perhaps she didn't. Perhaps she found her own way of being more than just a wife and mother. The pattern continued generation after generation, each woman navigating the constraints of her time as best she could. And that pattern continues still in different forms, in different contexts. The specific circumstances change, the technology changes, the laws change, but the fundamental dynamic of people trying to be fully human within systems that want to reduce them to roles remains. Marguerite's story is medieval, but its essence is timeless. The desire for autonomy, the need to be seen, the willingness to take risks to experience something real. These are human constants, playing out differently in each era, but never entirely disappearing. This is the hidden history. This is what really happened. Not the grand narratives of politics and war, but the private stories of individual people making choices, taking risks, trying to live on their own terms. These stories matter. They always did, even when no one bothered to record them, and they matter now as reminders that history is made up of countless individual lives, each one complex and worthy of attention, even when the official record reduces them to names and dates and simple categories like wife or mother or lady. Marguerite's story ended quietly. She died surrounded by family, her secrets intact, her reputation secure. She was remembered as a good woman, a dutiful wife, a loving mother. And she was all those things, but she was also more. She was a woman who seized a brief moment of freedom and made it count, who experienced desire and pleasure and autonomy, who proved to herself that she was more than her assigned role, and that, more than any official memorial or gravestone inscription, is what made her life significant. This is what happened when noble women's husbands left for war. Some version of this, repeated thousands of times with different details but similar essences. Women stepping out of their assigned roles, taking lovers, making choices, sometimes getting caught, sometimes getting away with it. Always dealing with the consequences, always carrying the weight of secrecy, always negotiating between who they were supposed to be and who they actually were. The stories mostly didn't survive, but the pattern did. And understanding that pattern helps us see medieval women and women throughout history not as passive victims or simple stereotypes, but as complex human beings doing their best to live fully in circumstances that made that very difficult. Marguerite's story is one small example. There were countless others. Most are lost now, but they happened, they mattered, and they're worth remembering. The pattern Marguerite had established was not unique to her. Across France, across all of Europe really, the same scenario played out in countless variations. Wars were constant in the medieval period, and noble husbands were frequently absent for months or years at a time. This left their wives in charge of estates, households, and their own lives in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. In the chateau just north of Marguerite's lands lived a woman named Isabel, who had a different approach entirely. Her husband had been gone for nearly 2 years, fighting in the king's campaigns in the south. Unlike Marguerite, Isabel had not taken a single lover. She had taken 3, sometimes 4 at once, running what amounted to a secret salon where she entertained young knights and nobles who were themselves waiting to join campaigns or recovering from injuries. Isabel was 32, beautiful and completely uninterested in the constraints society placed on her. Her husband was a brutal man who had beaten her regularly before he left. She felt no loyalty to him whatsoever. When he rode away to war, she had celebrated privately, knowing she had years of freedom ahead. She used that freedom fully. Her method was more organized than Marguerite's quiet affair. Isabel carefully selected her lovers from men who had as much to lose as she did, married knights who couldn't afford scandal, younger sons hoping for advantageous marriages, men whose reputations would be destroyed if they were caught. This mutual vulnerability created a kind of insurance. No one could expose Isabel without exposing themselves. She hosted gatherings several times a week, carefully disguised as cultural salons, poetry readings, music performances, discussions of philosophy and literature, all perfectly respectable activities for a noblewoman. But after the official entertainment ended and most guests departed, a select few would remain. What happened then was between consenting adults who understood the rules of discretion. Isabel's servants were well paid and loyal. She had replaced most of her husband's men with people she had chosen herself, people who owed their positions to her and who understood that their continued employment depended on silence. She ran her household like a small kingdom, with herself as absolute monarch, and it functioned beautifully in her husband's absence. The risk she took was enormous. If even one person talked, if any of her lovers had a crisis of conscience or got drunk and boasted, the entire structure would collapse. She would be ruined, possibly killed. Her husband was the type of man who would murder her without hesitation if he learned she had been unfaithful. But Isabel had calculated the risks and decided they were worth it. She would rather die having lived on her own terms than survive as a victim of her husband's cruelty. She and Marguerite knew each other, had met at various social functions, but they were not friends. Marguerite found Isabel's boldness terrifying. Isabel found Marguerite's caution boring. They represented different responses to the same situation, different strategies for claiming autonomy within a system designed to deny it to them. Further south, in a smaller estate near the coast, lived a woman named Anne who had chosen yet another path. Her husband had been gone for 8 months, and Anne had used that time not for affairs, but for scholarship. She had always been interested in learning, but her husband had forbidden her from studying anything beyond basic prayers and household management. He believed education made women difficult and disobedient. With him gone, Anne had hired tutors in secret. She was learning Latin, studying history and philosophy, reading texts that were normally reserved for men. She corresponded with scholars, pretending to be her own fictional brother in her letters. Several learned men across Europe were unknowingly sharing their knowledge, with a woman believing they were educating another man. Anne's rebellion was intellectual rather than sexual, but it was no less dangerous. Women who pursued learning were suspected of heresy, of dabbling in forbidden knowledge, of stepping beyond their natural limitations. If her husband returned and discovered what she had been doing, he could have her punished, possibly even tried by religious authorities for exceeding her proper role. But Anne didn't care. The knowledge she was gaining felt like light after years of darkness. She spent long nights reading by candlelight, her mind expanding in ways she had never imagined possible. She wrote essays that she could never publish under her own name. She debated philosophical questions with her tutors. She felt alive and engaged in a way that managing a household had never made her feel. These 3 women, Marguerite and Isabel and Anne, represented just a tiny fraction of the ways medieval women responded to their husbands' absences. Some took lovers, some pursued learning, some focused on accumulating power and wealth, some used the time to help the poor or engage in charitable works that their husbands would have considered wasteful. Some simply enjoyed the peace and quiet of not being constantly supervised and controlled. What they all had in common was secrecy. Everything had to be hidden, disguised, explained away. The constant vigilance required was exhausting. Every servant was a potential informant. Every visitor was a potential witness. Every letter sent or received was a risk. The mental and emotional labor of maintaining the deception while also managing estates and households and children was immense. Marguerite thought about this often during the months after her affair with Philippe ended. She wondered how many other women around her were living double lives, how many were carrying secrets that could destroy them, how many were finding ways to be more than what society allowed. She began to notice things she had missed before, the way certain women looked at men who were not their husbands, the coded language women used when discussing their lives, the subtle network of female solidarity that existed beneath the surface of formal social interactions, women helping each other, covering for each other, protecting each other's secrets even when they barely knew each other. There was a kind of sisterhood in this shared experience of constraint and rebellion. Women who would have been rivals in other contexts became allies because they understood what was at stake. A woman caught in adultery would be ruined, but so would any woman who could have been in her position. Every scandal reinforced the restrictions on all women. Every successful deception was a small victory for all of them. Marguerite began to participate more actively in this network. When she heard whispers about a young noblewoman who might be having an affair, she didn't spread the gossip. She found ways to provide alibis, to explain away suspicious behavior, to redirect attention. She became known among certain women as someone who could be trusted, who understood discretion, who would help rather than judge. This gave her life a new kind of purpose. Her affair with Philippe had been about her own desires and needs, but this larger project of helping other women was about something bigger. It was about creating small spaces of freedom within an oppressive system. It was about women supporting each other in ways that men would never understand or approve of. She became particularly close to Catherine during this period. The two women had maintained a distant public friendship after Marguerite's affair with Philippe ended, but now they grew genuinely close. They began meeting regularly, ostensibly for prayer or needlework or other acceptable activities, but really to talk about the lives women were actually living versus the lives they were supposed to be living. Catherine had her own stories. She had facilitated dozens of affairs over the years, providing her chateau as a safe meeting place for women and their lovers. She had helped women hide pregnancies that resulted from these affairs, arranging for babies to be quietly adopted by peasant families or placed in convents. She had created alibis, destroyed incriminating letters, paid off servants who knew too much. She had built an entire infrastructure for female resistance, and she had done it so quietly that most people had no idea it existed. "Why do you do it?" Marguerite asked her once. "You're not having affairs yourself. You're not directly benefiting. Why take the risk?" Catherine thought about this for a long moment. "Because," she said finally, "someone has to. Because women are going to have affairs and get pregnant and make mistakes regardless. If people like me don't help them, they'll be destroyed by a system that was designed to destroy them. At least this way some of them survive. Some of them get to live a little before the cage closes again." Marguerite understood. This was not about condoning or condemning anyone's choices. It was about recognizing that women were going to make choices and trying to minimize the harm that came from those choices. It was about solidarity in the face of shared oppression. The two women worked together on several cases. A young wife whose husband had left for the Crusades and who had fallen in love with a local merchant. An older noblewoman whose husband was impotent and who wanted a child to secure her position. A widow who was being forced by her family to remarry but who wanted to remain independent. Each situation was different. Each required different strategies, but the underlying principle was the same. Help women survive. Protect their secrets. Create space for them to be human. Not all the stories had happy endings. One woman they tried to help was caught by her husband's spies. He had left servants behind specifically to watch his wife, suspicious of her fidelity. She was locked in her chambers for months, then divorced and sent to a convent where she would spend the rest of her life. Marguerite and Catherine heard about it weeks after it happened. There had been nothing they could do. The failure haunted Marguerite. She had been so careful with her own affair, had thought she understood the risks. But this woman had been even more careful and still been caught. It was a reminder that no amount of caution could eliminate the danger entirely. The system was designed to catch and punish women who stepped out of line. Some would always fall through the cracks. But this didn't stop Marguerite from continuing. If anything, it made her more determined. Every woman she helped successfully felt like a small victory against an unjust system. Every affair that remained hidden, every pregnancy that was quietly managed, every scandal that was diffused before it could destroy someone, these were all tiny acts of resistance that added up to something meaningful. Robert remained oblivious to all of this. He had returned from war and resumed his life as if nothing had changed. He managed his estates, conducted his business, made decisions without consulting Marguerite about anything important. He assumed she had spent his absence managing the household and nothing more. It would never have occurred to him that she had her own complex life, her own network, her own purposes. This suited Marguerite perfectly. His ignorance was her protection. As long as he saw her as the dutiful wife, as long as he believed she was content with the narrow role assigned to her, she could continue her actual work undetected. She became more skilled at deception over time, not just hiding her own activities, but helping others hide theirs. She learned to read situations quickly, to identify risks, to know when to push and when to retreat. She developed an instinct for danger that kept her safe even as she took calculated risks. One of the most interesting cases involved a woman named Marie who lived in a chateau about a day's ride from Marguerite's lands. Marie's husband had been gone for over a year, and during that time Marie had fallen genuinely in love with one of her husband's knights, a man named Thomas who had been left behind to help protect the estate. This was different from a casual affair. Marie and Thomas wanted to be together permanently. They talked about running away, fleeing to another country where no one knew them, starting a new life. But this was almost impossible in practice. They had no money of their own. They would be pursued. They would be caught and punished, probably executed. The laws against adultery were severe, and the penalties for a wife who abandoned her husband were even worse. Marguerite counselled caution. Running away was too dangerous. But she understood the desire. She had felt something similar with Philippe that pulled towards something more than a temporary affair, though in her case she had been wise enough not to pursue it. Marie and Thomas continued their affair for months, growing bolder, taking more risks. They talked openly about their feelings in front of servants. They disappeared together for hours at a time. They were building toward disaster and seemed unable or unwilling to see it. Marguerite tried to warn Marie. She explained the risks, the consequences, what would happen if they were caught. But Marie was too much in love to listen. She believed her love for Thomas was special, that it transcended the normal rules, that somehow they would find a way to be together. They were caught, inevitably. A servant who felt more loyalty to Marie's absent husband than to Marie herself sent word of the affair. The husband returned early from campaign, burst into the chateau with armed men, and found Marie and Thomas together. What happened next was brutal. Thomas was executed immediately, killed in the courtyard while Marie watched. Marie was locked in a tower room and tried for adultery. The trial was a formality. She was found guilty and sentenced to life in a convent, which in practice meant being locked in a small cell until she died, with minimal food and no contact with the outside world. Marguerite heard about it from Catherine, who had gotten the news from a travelling merchant. They sat together in Catherine's solar, both women silent, processing the horror of what had happened. This was the reality they all lived with. This was what awaited women who were caught. "It's not fair," Marguerite said finally. "Thomas was executed quickly. It was over in moments. Marie will suffer for years, decades maybe. Why is the punishment so much worse for her?" Catherine's expression was bitter. "Because she's a woman," she said. "Because her crime is considered worse. A man who commits adultery is weak or foolish. A woman who commits adultery is evil, unnatural, a threat to the entire social order. The punishment has to be severe, enough to frighten other women into obedience." They sat in silence for a while longer, both thinking about Marie locked in her cell, about Thomas dead in an unmarked grave, about the love between them that had been destroyed by laws designed to prevent women from having any autonomy. "Does it make you want to stop?" Catherine asked. "Helping other women? Knowing this could happen to them? To you?" Marguerite thought about it. Part of her did want to stop, wanted to retreat into safety and never take another risk. But another part of her knew she couldn't, because if people like her and Catherine stopped helping, women like Marie would have no one. They would make their mistakes and pay terrible prices with no support, no guidance, no one to help them navigate the dangers. "No," Marguerite said. "It makes me want to be smarter, to help women understand the risks better, to make sure they know what they're risking before they risk it." Catherine nodded. "That's what I thought you'd say." They continued their work, but with more caution. They were more selective about who they helped. They were more honest about the potential consequences. They pushed back harder when women seemed to be heading toward disaster. Sometimes this made them unpopular. Women who wanted permission or encouragement were disappointed when Marguerite and Catherine instead offered warnings and risk assessments. But the women who listened, who took the warnings seriously, were the ones who survived. They had their affairs or pursued their learning or did whatever else they needed to do to feel human, but they did it carefully, with full awareness of the stakes. And most of them got away with it because they were smart and cautious and willing to accept that their freedom would always be limited and temporary. Years passed. Marguerite grew older. Her children married and had children of their own. Robert aged too, becoming less interested in managing the estate, delegating more to Marguerite. This gave her even more power and freedom, though by now she was less interested in affairs and more interested in the broader project of helping other women. She became a kind of wise woman. Someone younger noblewomen came to for advice. She helped them understand their marriages, their limited options, the ways they could carve out small spaces of autonomy without destroying themselves. She was honest about the constraints and realistic about what was possible. Some women appreciated this. Others found her depressing, wanted her to tell them they could have everything they wanted. But Marguerite had learned through hard experience that honesty, however painful, was more valuable than false hope. Philippe married and had children and grew into middle age. Marguerite saw him occasionally at social functions. They were polite and distant, like any two nobles who knew each other slightly. Whatever had been between them was long buried, a memory that neither of them discussed or acknowledged. Marguerite wondered sometimes if he thought about those afternoons in the tower room, if he remembered her as she remembered him. But she never asked, and he never said. Catherine remained Marguerite's closest friend. They continued their work together until Catherine died suddenly of a fever when she was 53. Marguerite mourned her deeply, not just as a friend but as a partner in their secret project. Catherine had helped dozens of women over the years, maybe hundreds. She had saved lives and prevented scandals and created spaces for female autonomy. And almost no one except Marguerite and a few other women knew. When Catherine died, she was remembered as a respectable widow who had managed her estate well. Her real legacy was invisible. After Catherine's death, Marguerite continued alone. She was older now, less energetic, but still committed. She helped when she could, advised when asked, protected secrets when needed. She had become an institution of sorts, though only among a small network of women who understood what she was really doing. She thought often about patterns and cycles, about how each generation of women had to relearn the same lessons, about how the constraints never really changed, just shifted slightly in response to changing circumstances, about how women kept finding ways to resist and survive despite everything designed to break them. Her granddaughter, the one who had asked about marriage, came to her years later with a different question. She had been married for 5 years. Her husband was away frequently on business. She had met someone, was thinking about having an affair. She wanted her grandmother's advice. Marguerite looked at this young woman and saw herself decades earlier standing at the same crossroads. She thought about what to say, how to balance honesty with compassion, warning with understanding. "Tell me what you want," Marguerite said. "Not what you think you should want, what you actually want." The granddaughter was quiet for a long moment. "I want to feel alive," she said finally. "I want to feel like I matter as myself, not just as someone's wife. I want to make my own choices, even if they're dangerous." Marguerite understood completely. Those were the same things she had wanted, the same things every woman in her position wanted, the same things that led some women to have affairs, and others to pursue learning, and others to focus on accumulating power. Different methods, same underlying need. "Then do it," Marguerite said, "but be smart about it. Understand the risks. Have an exit strategy. Pay your servants well, never put anything in writing, and remember that this freedom is temporary. Eventually your husband will come back, or someone will notice, or something will go wrong. Have your affair or whatever you're going to do, but do it with your eyes open." The granddaughter looked surprised. "I thought you'd tell me not to," she said. Marguerite shook her head. "I can't tell you how to live your life. No one can, despite what they claim. You're going to make your own choices, regardless of what I say. I'm just trying to make sure you survive those choices." "Did you?" the granddaughter asked. "Did you have affairs when grandfather was away?" Marguerite smiled slightly. "That's not a question I'm going to answer," she said. "Some secrets stay secrets. But I will tell you this. I survived. I found ways to be more than just a wife and mother, even if I couldn't do it openly. I made choices that I never regretted, even though they were risky. And I'm still here." The granddaughter nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. She left shortly after that, and Marguerite never knew what she decided to do. Whether she had the affair or didn't. Whether she was careful or reckless. Whether she survived or was caught. The granddaughter never brought it up again, and Marguerite didn't ask. That was part of the code. You helped when asked, but you didn't pry. Everyone was entitled to their secrets. Marguerite lived another 8 years after that conversation. She died at 68, which was old for that era, surrounded by family who thought they knew her. They remembered her as a devoted wife to Robert, as a caring mother and grandmother, as a wise and capable woman who had managed the estate well during her husband's many absences. They didn't know about Philippe. They didn't know about the network of women she had helped. They didn't know about the affairs she had facilitated, the pregnancies she had hidden, the scandals she had prevented. All of that remained secret, carried to the grave by Marguerite and the small circle of women who had shared that hidden life with her. But the impact of her work continued. The women she had helped went on to help others. The advice she had given was passed down to daughters and granddaughters. The network she had been part of continued to exist, evolving with each generation, but maintaining its core purpose of helping women survive in a system designed to crush them. This was the real history of medieval women, not the simplified version where they sat passively at home waiting for their husbands to return, but a complex story of resistance and survival, of women finding ways to be human in circumstances that tried to reduce them to functions. Some of them had affairs, some pursued learning, some focused on power, some just enjoyed the peace and quiet of being alone. But all of them were making choices, taking risks, living as fully as they could within the constraints that bound them. The official histories mostly ignored these stories. They focused on kings and battles and treaties, on the public world where men operated. Women appeared in these histories primarily as wives who produced heirs or as pawns in political marriages. Their actual lives, their desires and choices and rebellions were considered unimportant, not worthy of documentation. But the stories existed anyway, in oral traditions, in private letters that occasionally survived, in the architectural details of chateaux that included hidden staircases and secret rooms built specifically to facilitate affairs, in the account books that showed payments to servants for unnamed services, in the legal records of women accused of adultery, in the church records of annulments and divorces. If you know what to look for, if you read between the lines, the evidence is everywhere. Medieval women were not passive. They were not content with their limited roles. They pushed back in countless small ways, creating spaces of autonomy within oppressive structures. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed, but they kept trying, generation after generation, each one building on what the previous generation had learned. Marguerite's story was just one thread in this larger tapestry. But it was a real thread, representing real experiences that real women had. The affair with Philippe happened. The network of women helping each other existed. The constant negotiation between public respectability and private rebellion was an everyday reality for countless women. And it continues, in different forms, in different contexts. The specific details change with each era. The technology changes, the laws change, the social structures evolve, but the fundamental dynamic remains. People in constrained circumstances finding ways to be more fully human. People taking risks to experience autonomy and desire and choice. People supporting each other in resistance against systems that want to deny them agency. Marguerite's granddaughter did have an affair, though Marguerite never knew it. She was careful, following her grandmother's advice. She paid her servants well. She never put anything in writing. She maintained perfect public respectability. And she got away with it, enjoying 2 years of freedom before her husband returned and her life went back to normal. She never regretted it. Like Marguerite, she saw those years as proof that she was more than her assigned role, that she had desires and agency, that she could make her own choices, even dangerous ones, and survive. The affair ended and life went on, but something inside her had changed. She was never quite as obedient after that, never quite as accepting of limitations. She found other ways to push back, smaller ways that were safer, but still meaningful. And she eventually passed this knowledge to her own daughter, who passed it to her daughter, creating a line of women who understood that the roles society assigned them were not all they could be, that rebellion was possible even if it had to be secret, that solidarity with other women mattered more than competition, that surviving with your humanity intact was an achievement worth celebrating. This generational transmission of knowledge was crucial. Without it, each woman would have to start from nothing, making the same mistakes, learning the same painful lessons. But with it, each generation could build on what the previous one had learned. The strategies became more sophisticated, the networks became more secure, the survival rate improved. By the time Marguerite's great-great-granddaughter was navigating her own marriage in the 15th century, the world had changed somewhat. Wars were still constant. Husbands were still frequently absent. Women still managed estates in their husbands' absence. But there was more infrastructure now for women's resistance, more established networks, more shared knowledge about what worked and what didn't. Some things hadn't changed at all. Women were still property. Adultery was still a crime. Getting caught still meant disaster, but the methods for not getting caught had evolved. The strategies were better. The support systems were stronger. More women survived their rebellions, even if those rebellions remained secret. This is what really happened when noblewomen's husbands left for war. The full story, the complex story, the story that includes Marguerite and Isabel and Anne and Catherine and Marie and Thomas and Philippe and all the unnamed women who lived similar lives. The story that shows medieval women as full human beings, not simplified stereotypes, as people with agency and desire, making choices within extremely constrained circumstances, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing, but always trying. The official history will never tell this story. It's too messy, too private, too focused on women's experiences to fit into narratives about kings and battles. But it's real. It happened. And it matters, both as history and as a reminder that people have always found ways to resist oppression, to claim autonomy, to be fully human even when systems try to reduce them to functions. Marguerite's affair with Philippe was just one small example of this larger pattern, but it was real. She really did meet him in the tower room. She really did risk everything for a few months of freedom. She really did help other women do the same. And she really did take those memories to her grave, secure in the knowledge that she had lived more fully than anyone except a few trusted confidants ever knew. This is the hidden history of medieval women. Not noble and idealized, not simplified into virtue or vice, but complex and human and real. Women finding ways to survive, to resist, to live on their own terms, even when those terms were severely limited. Their stories deserve to be told, even if they were never recorded in official documents. They deserve to be remembered, even if only in reconstructions like this that try to imagine what those hidden lives might have been like. And perhaps, most importantly, their stories deserve to be understood not as exceptions or scandals, but as examples of the universal human need for autonomy and choice. Marguerite wanted the same things people want now: to be seen, to be desired, to make her own decisions, to matter as herself, not just as someone's wife or mother. These are not historically specific desires, they're human constants, playing out differently in each era, but never disappearing entirely. So this is what happened when noblewomen's husbands left for war. Some of them remained faithful, some had affairs, some pursued learning, some focused on power. All of them made choices within the limited options available to them. And many of them, like Marguerite, found ways to be more than what society wanted them to be, even if only temporarily, even if only in secret. Their stories are worth remembering, worth telling, worth understanding as part of the full complexity of human history, not just the simplified version that focuses only on public events and powerful men. Because history is made up of countless individual lives, each one complex and worthy of attention, each one containing experiences and choices and resistance that shaped who we are today. Marguerite lived and died. Her secrets were buried with her, but the pattern she was part of continues in different forms, in different contexts, wherever people find themselves constrained by systems that try to deny them full humanity. Her story is medieval, but its essence is timeless, and that's why it's worth telling, even now, even centuries after she lived. Isabel's story, the one Marguerite had heard about in fragments over the years, deserved more attention. While Marguerite had been cautious and selective, Isabel had been bold to the point of recklessness. Her chateau had become something close to legendary among the small circle of women who knew what really went on there. Isabel's husband Guillaume had been one of the most brutal men in the region. He had beaten Isabel regularly during their marriage, had humiliated her publicly, had treated her as less than human. When he left for war, Isabel had felt like a prisoner being released from a dungeon. She had sworn to herself that she would use every moment of his absence to reclaim what he had taken from her. Her first lover had been a young knight named Richard who had been left behind to help guard the estate. He was 22, inexperienced, almost innocent. Isabel seduced him within a week of Guillaume's departure. It was not difficult. Richard was lonely and far from home, and Isabel knew exactly how to make herself appealing. They began meeting in her chambers late at night after the household had gone to sleep. But one lover was not enough for Isabel. She was making up for years of abuse and denial. Within a month, she had taken a second lover, a travelling merchant who passed through regularly. Then a third, a minor noble from a neighbouring estate. Then a fourth. She was not interested in love or emotional connection. She wanted pleasure and power, wanted to prove to herself that she could have as many men as she wanted, that she was desirable and valuable, despite everything Guillaume had told her. She developed a system for managing multiple lovers, different men on different days, careful scheduling so they never overlapped, payments to servants who might have noticed the unusual traffic in and out of her chambers. She treated the whole thing like a military campaign, with strategies and tactics and contingency plans. The risk was enormous. If any of her lovers talked, if any servant betrayed her, if Guillaume heard even a whisper of rumour, she would die. Not metaphorically, actually die. Guillaume would kill her with his own hands. But Isabel found that the risk made everything more exciting. She was playing a dangerous game and winning, and that felt better than safety ever had. She began hosting the salons shortly after taking her fourth lover. They started as genuine cultural events. Isabel had always been interested in poetry and music, but Guillaume had forbidden such frivolities. Now she invited poets and musicians to perform at her chateau. She invited other nobles to attend, creating an atmosphere of refined culture and learning. The salons were genuinely enjoyable. People came for the entertainment and the conversation. But Isabel also used them as cover for her affairs. Lovers could visit openly as guests at the salon, and no one would question their presence. After the official events ended, select individuals would remain, and what happened then was hidden behind closed doors. Isabel's confidence grew with each successful deception. She started to believe she was untouchable, that she was too clever to be caught. This was a dangerous mindset, but it sustained her through months of increasingly bold behaviour. She met Marguerite only once during this period, at a gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance. The two women recognised something in each other immediately, though they didn't speak openly about it. They exchanged pleasantries and then moved on to talk with other guests. But later Marguerite heard stories about Isabel from other women. Stories that both impressed and frightened her. Isabel was doing everything Marguerite had been too cautious to attempt. She was living fully and fearlessly, claiming her autonomy in the most complete way possible. But she was also heading toward disaster. Marguerite could see it clearly, even if Isabel couldn't. Too many lovers meant too many people who could betray her. Too much boldness meant too many opportunities to be noticed. Eventually, something would go wrong. It took almost a year, but Marguerite's prediction proved accurate. One of Isabel's lovers, the young knight Richard, fell genuinely in love with her. He wanted more than occasional nights together. He wanted Isabel to run away with him, to leave her husband and her estate and start a new life. When Isabel refused, explaining that this was impossible and that she had never promised him anything beyond physical pleasure, Richard became angry and then desperate. He threatened to expose her unless she agreed to leave with him. Isabel tried to calm him, to make him see reason, but Richard was beyond reason. He was young and passionate and convinced that his love gave him rights over Isabel that she had never actually granted him. Isabel did what she had to do. She had Richard arrested on fabricated charges of theft. She used her authority as Lady of the Chateau to have him thrown in the dungeons and then quietly executed. It was brutal, but necessary. Richard could have destroyed her, could have gotten her killed. She eliminated the threat before he could act on it. But the incident shook Isabel badly. She had killed someone to protect her secret. She had crossed a line she hadn't known existed. The affair that had been about pleasure and freedom had turned into something dark and dangerous. She began to question what she was doing, whether it was worth the cost. She reduced the number of her lovers from 4 to 2. She became more cautious, more selective. The salons continued, but the atmosphere changed. There was less joy in it, more anxiety. Isabel was starting to understand that her rebellion had consequences that extended beyond herself. When Guillaume finally returned from war, 3 years after he had left, Isabel had already ended all her affairs. She had sent her lovers away with gifts and threats, making clear that they were never to speak of what had happened. She had replaced servants who knew too much. She had destroyed any evidence that could be used against her. Guillaume never learned what his wife had done during his absence. He resumed his abuse immediately, as if he had never been gone. Isabel endured it because she had no choice. But something inside her had changed. She had experienced freedom, had lived on her own terms, even if only temporarily. Guillaume could beat her body, but he couldn't touch that core of self she had reclaimed. She survived another 15 years before Guillaume finally died, falling from his horse during a hunt. Isabel was 48 when she became a widow, finally and permanently free. She never remarried. She spent the rest of her life managing her estate, hosting her salons, and helping other women navigate the constrained circumstances of their lives. Marguerite heard about Isabel's widowhood and felt a complicated mixture of emotions: relief that Isabel had survived, sadness for the years of abuse she had endured, respect for her resilience. The two women never became close friends, their personalities too different, but they maintained a distant connection built on mutual understanding. Anne's story followed a different trajectory entirely. Her pursuit of learning during her husband's absence had opened doors she hadn't known existed. The tutors she hired in secret were impressed by her intelligence and dedication. One of them, an elderly scholar named Brother Mathieu, began to suspect that his supposed male student was actually a woman. When he finally confronted Anne about it, she expected him to be scandalized and withdraw his services. Instead, Brother Mathieu was delighted. He had spent his life believing that women were as capable of learning as men, a heretical view that he had mostly kept to himself. Finding a woman who proved his theory was vindication. He began teaching Anne even more intensively, sharing texts and ideas that were normally forbidden to women. Through Brother Mathieu, Anne was introduced to a small network of learned women across Europe. They corresponded using male pseudonyms or writing as secretaries to fictional brothers. They shared ideas and translations and commentaries on philosophical and theological texts. They created their own intellectual community, hidden but vibrant, existing in the margins of the male-dominated scholarly world. Anne's husband returned after 18 months away. He never discovered what his wife had been doing. Anne hid her books and papers, destroyed evidence of her correspondence, dismissed her tutors. She went back to managing the household and playing the role of dutiful wife. But she continued learning in secret. She read late at night when everyone else was asleep. She corresponded with her network of women scholars, being even more careful now to hide the letters. She wrote essays that would never be published under her own name, but that she shared with a small circle of people who would appreciate them. Her intellectual life became her real life, the thing that mattered most to her. Everything else, the management of the household, the social obligations, even her relationship with her husband, felt like surface activities that didn't touch her true self. She never had children, which was unusual and slightly scandalous. People whispered that she must be barren or that her husband must be impotent. The truth was simpler. Anne and her husband rarely shared a bed. He found her cold and uninteresting. She found him crude and intellectually limited. They had a marriage in name only, which suited Anne perfectly. It gave her freedom to pursue what actually interested her. She lived to be 59, dying of a sudden illness that gave her no time to prepare. Her papers were discovered after her death by a servant who was cleaning out her chambers. The servant, unable to read, showed them to the local priest, thinking they might be valuable. The priest was shocked to discover philosophical and theological writings in a woman's hand, some of them touching on ideas that bordered on heresy. He wanted to have Anne's body exhumed and subjected to investigation for heresy, but Anne's husband, who had been indifferent to her in life, protected her reputation in death. He claimed the papers must have been copied from other sources, that his wife had merely been preserving texts she found interesting. He burned the papers publicly, destroying Anne's intellectual legacy to protect the family name. But Anne's ideas survived in the letters she had sent to her network of women scholars. Those women copied and shared her essays, attributed them to male pseudonyms, incorporated her thinking into their own work. Anne's intellectual contributions became part of the underground stream of women's scholarship that existed alongside but hidden from official academic discourse. Marguerite never met Anne, but she heard about her after her death through Catherine. The story made Marguerite think about the different forms resistance could take. Anne had never had an affair, had never broken the sexual rules that constrained women, but she had violated equally important boundaries by pursuing learning that was forbidden to her. In some ways, her rebellion was more radical than Marguerite's or Isabel's because it challenged not just behavioral expectations, but the fundamental assumption that women were intellectually inferior to men. These three women, Marguerite and Isabel and Anne, represented different strategies for claiming autonomy within an oppressive system. Marguerite had been cautious and selective, taking measured risks. Isabel had been bold and reckless, pushing boundaries as far as they could go. Anne had been intellectual and subversive, challenging assumptions rather than just breaking rules. None of their strategies was perfect. Each came with costs and limitations, but together they showed the range of possibilities available to women who refused to accept the narrow roles assigned to them. They proved that even in the most constrained circumstances, human agency found ways to express itself. Marguerite thought about this often in her later years. She had helped dozens of women navigate their own paths to autonomy. Some had followed her cautious approach, others had been more like Isabel, bold and risk-taking. A few had been like Anne, finding rebellion through intellectual or spiritual pursuits rather than sexual ones. What mattered was not which approach was best, but that women had options, that they could make choices even if those choices were limited and dangerous, that they could support each other in those choices, creating networks of solidarity that made survival more likely. The network Marguerite and Catherine had built continued to grow after Catherine's death. Other women took on leadership roles, maintaining the infrastructure of secret meetings and coded messages and mutual support. The network evolved with each generation, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its core purpose. By the time Marguerite was in her 60s, she was something like an elder stateswoman of this hidden world. Younger women came to her for advice and wisdom. She told them stories, carefully disguised to protect identities, about women who had succeeded and women who had failed. She taught them to assess risks and make careful plans. She connected them with each other, building relationships that would sustain them through their own struggles. She also warned them that things were changing, not necessarily for the better. The church was becoming more concerned with controlling women's sexuality. New laws were being written that increased penalties for adultery. The spaces for female autonomy were shrinking, not expanding. But Marguerite also saw reasons for hope. More women were learning to read and write. Convents were becoming centres of female learning and administration, offering women alternatives to marriage. Trade and commerce were creating new economic opportunities that gave some women financial independence. The constraints remained severe, but cracks were appearing in the system. One of Marguerite's last acts before she died was to help establish a more formal structure for the network. She worked with several other older women to create a kind of oral tradition, stories and lessons that would be passed down to new generations. They developed coded language and symbols that would allow women to identify each other as part of the network. They created safe houses and established relationships with sympathetic priests and merchants who would help women in crisis. It was not a revolution, it was barely even organized resistance, but it was something. It was women taking care of each other, protecting each other, helping each other survive. And in an era when women were largely powerless, that was significant. Marguerite's death was peaceful. She had lived long enough to see her children grown and successful, her grandchildren thriving. She had managed the estate well enough that Robert's legacy was secure. She had fulfilled all her official duties as wife and mother and lady of the manor. But more importantly, at least to herself, she had helped countless women claim moments of autonomy and freedom. She had facilitated affairs and hidden pregnancies and prevented scandals. She had given advice that saved lives. She had built networks that would outlast her. She had been part of something larger than herself, a hidden history of female resistance that ran like an underground river through medieval society. On her deathbed, surrounded by family who had no idea about her secret life, Marguerite thought about Philippe one last time. She wondered if he was still alive, if he remembered her, if those afternoons in the tower room meant anything to him now. Probably not. He had moved on with his life, had other lovers surely, had his own family and concerns. But those afternoons had meant everything to Marguerite. Not because Philippe was special, though he had been kind and skilled and genuinely interested in her pleasure, but because those hours represented freedom. They represented her choosing, her wanting, her being seen as herself rather than as someone's property. That feeling had sustained her through decades of constraint. The memory of it had kept part of her alive that might otherwise have been crushed. And that was worth all the risk, all the secrecy, all the constant vigilance required to maintain the deception. Marguerite died knowing she had lived more fully than anyone except a few trusted women knew. Her official legacy was respectable and proper. Her real legacy was hidden, but perhaps more important. She had helped change what was possible for women, had contributed to networks and traditions that would help future generations navigate their own constrained circumstances. The stories of Marguerite and Isabel and Anne and the countless other women who found ways to resist oppression were mostly lost to history. The official records barely mention them. They appear in documents only as names attached to their husbands, as mothers of important sons, as property transferred in marriage contracts. Their actual lives, their desires and choices and rebellions went unrecorded. But traces remain, in architecture that includes hidden passages and secret rooms, in account books showing unexplained expenses, in court records of women accused of adultery, in letters between women discussing matters in careful code, in oral traditions passed down through generations, in the structure of female networks that persisted across centuries. If you know what to look for, if you understand how to read between the lines, the evidence is everywhere. Medieval women were not passive victims. They were not content with their assigned roles. They pushed back in countless ways, creating spaces for autonomy and desire and choice within systems designed to deny them all three. Some were caught and punished. Some got away with it. Most fell somewhere in between, managing to claim small freedoms while avoiding complete disaster. Their individual stories were different, but they were all part of the same larger story. The story of humans resisting oppression, of people finding ways to be fully themselves even when society wanted to reduce them to functions and roles. This is what really happened when noblewomen's husbands left for war. Behind the official narrative of faithful wives dutifully managing estates was a complex reality of women making choices, taking risks, supporting each other, and claiming what autonomy they could. The details varied enormously from person to person, but the pattern was consistent across time and place. Wars created opportunities for female autonomy because they removed the men who normally controlled women's lives. This was not always a good thing. Women left alone were also vulnerable to violence and exploitation. Estate management was hard work with serious consequences. The freedom came with enormous responsibility and risk. But for some women like Marguerite, the opportunity was worth the challenges. Those months or years when their husbands were away represented the only time in their lives when they had genuine power and freedom. They used that time in whatever ways made sense to them, always knowing it was temporary, always aware that eventually they would have to give it all up and return to being obedient wives. The psychology of this must have been incredibly difficult, to taste freedom and then have it taken away, to experience desire and autonomy and choice, and then watch those experiences become nothing but memories, to know what you were capable of but have to pretend you were content with so much less. Some women handled this well. They compartmentalized, kept their secret selves separate from their public selves, accepted the duality as the price of survival. Others struggled more. The contrast between who they had been during their husbands' absences and who they had to be after their return caused genuine psychological pain. Marguerite had been fortunate in some ways. Her affair with Philippe had been brief enough that she hadn't formed a deep emotional attachment. She had been able to move on, to integrate the experience into her life without it destroying her. Not all women were so lucky. Some fell genuinely in love with their lovers and suffered terribly when those relationships had to end. The network Marguerite helped build tried to address this. Older women counseled younger ones about the emotional risks of affairs. They warned against falling in love, against believing that temporary freedom could become permanent. They tried to help women protect themselves emotionally, even as they took physical and social risks. It didn't always work. Love was unpredictable and ungovernable. Some women couldn't help but fall deeply for their lovers, couldn't accept that the relationships had to end. These were the women who were most likely to make desperate choices, to try to run away or to refuse to give up their lovers when their husbands returned. These were the women who ended up like Marie, destroyed by the system they tried to escape. The network tried to save these women when possible. Sometimes they succeeded. They helped women hide pregnancies from affairs, arranged for adoption or for babies to be passed off as legitimate children. They created cover stories and alibis. They bribed officials and intimidated servants. They did whatever was necessary to protect women from the consequences of their choices. But they couldn't save everyone. Some women were too careless or too unlucky. Some were betrayed by people they trusted. Some were caught in circumstances that no amount of cleverness could navigate. These failures haunted the women of the network, reminders of how high the stakes were, how fragile their protection really was. Marguerite carried the weight of these failures with her always. She remembered each woman she had tried to help who ended up destroyed anyway. She wondered what she could have done differently, what advice might have saved them, what warning might have made them more careful. The guilt never entirely left her, though she learned to live with it. But she also celebrated the successes. Every woman who had an affair and survived it. Every pregnancy that was hidden successfully. Every scandal that was prevented. These were victories against an unjust system. Proof that resistance was possible even if it had to be secret and temporary. The broader historical forces that shaped these women's lives were mostly beyond their control. Wars happened because kings wanted territory or revenge. Economic systems exploited everyone, women just more than men. Religious doctrine declared women inferior and subordinate. Laws gave husbands complete authority over wives. No amount of individual resistance could change these fundamental structures. But individual resistance still mattered. It mattered to the women who experienced it, who got to live more fully, even if only briefly. It mattered to the networks and traditions that grew from it, that helped future generations. And it mattered as testimony that humans will always find ways to resist oppression, that agency persists even in the most constrained circumstances. Marguerite understood this instinctively, even if she never articulated it in those terms. She knew her affair with Philippe hadn't changed the world. She knew the network she helped build wasn't going to overthrow the patriarchal system. But she also knew that these small acts of resistance accumulated into something meaningful. That they kept part of women's humanity alive that the system wanted to crush. That they created spaces, however temporary and limited, where women could be more than what society demanded. This was enough. It had to be enough, because revolutionary change was impossible, but individual survival was achievable. And helping women survive while maintaining some core of autonomy and dignity was valuable work, even if it would never be recognized or celebrated openly. The stories of these women, Marguerite and Isabel and Anne and Catherine and Marie and countless others whose names have been lost, are the hidden history of medieval Europe. They're the stories that official documents don't record, that male chroniclers never thought to write down, that were considered too private or too scandalous to preserve. But they're real history nonetheless. They're what actually happened in the lives of thousands of women across centuries. They're the truth behind the simplified narratives about faithful wives and virtuous ladies. They're evidence that women have always been full human beings with desires and agency, even when systems try to reduce them to property and functions. And they're relevant today because the fundamental dynamics haven't entirely changed. Women still navigate systems that try to limit them. They still make choices within constrained circumstances. They still support each other in ways that men often don't understand or notice. The specific details are different now, the constraints less severe in many ways, but the pattern persists. Marguerite's story is medieval, but it resonates across time because it's ultimately about something universal. About humans wanting to be seen and desired and free. About making choices even when choices are dangerous. About supporting each other against systems that want to divide and control. About surviving with dignity in circumstances designed to deny it. This is what really happened when noblewomen's husbands, left for war. This is the full story, complex and messy and human. Not heroic or simple. Not entirely victorious or entirely tragic. Just real people doing their best to live fully in circumstances that made that extremely difficult. Their stories deserve to be told and remembered and understood as part of the complete history of medieval Europe. Not footnotes, but central narratives about how half the population actually lived.